Welcome to Candid Conversation number 103. I was asked a couple questions. How do I find a godly wife? And how do I stay pure before marriage? So we'll cover the first question first. How do I find a godly wife? The first thing I recommend is, of course, reading the Bible. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 gives you the guidelines for finding, or I'd say God's suggestions for and commandments for marriage for today in the dispensation of grace. The first thing to note that Paul mentions is, he says, and I can say this true because I've been single and now I've been married for over 7 years, and that is that being married takes time away from the spiritual. And so you have to, because you have to consider your wife, that when you get married, the two become one flesh. And before, you had to consider just, taking care of your own flesh. Well, now you got to take care of your wife's flesh too. And so so it's just going to take longer, practically speaking, it takes longer for the two together. A lot of times a woman will like to stay with the man, whereas you may be used to being independent, being single, do what you want to do. Well, now you got to consider what your wife wants to do. And she probably doesn't want to do things. You do what you want to do, and she does what she wants to do. She wants to do everything together. To her, it's more important for the two of you to be together and do something that both of you just don't really care about doing. She'd rather be together with both of you doing something you aren't too excited about doing, than for you to do something by yourself that you're excited about doing, and her doing something by herself that she's excited about doing. For her, what makes her excited is just to be with you, because the two have become one. See, her role is to submit to you. And so since she's a part of you, and she gets her glory comes from you. Your glory comes from Christ. And this is from 1 Corinthians 11. It mentions the glory of the man is Christ. The glory of the woman is the man. And so or I should say the head is what I should have said. The head of the woman is the man, and the head of the man is Christ. That's what I meant to say. So just like your body doesn't want to be by itself, your spouse, your wife, doesn't want to be without you. And we're talking about a godly woman. I'm sure there are, exceptions. And also, I shouldn't say a woman is ungodly if she doesn't want to do that, because it also depends on how you're raised. My mother doesn't like being around people. That's just how she was raised. So, she's very independent. So I'm not saying you're an ungodly woman if you don't want to be with your husband. But in general, that's how it works. That's just how God made women versus men. So you're going to spend more time with your wife, less time doing what you want to do, and which means you have less time to serve the Lord in that respect. Now the plus side, though, it depends on how you look at it, is that since you are now the spiritual head of the household, then you are in charge of her spiritual growth. You're responsible for that. And again, she's her own thinker, so she can think what she wants. But if you're marrying a godly woman and she wants to grow in the Lord, then you will feel a greater responsibility for that than before you were married. So it can actually help your spiritual growth. That's how it was with me. I started Bible studies just after I was married, and the reason I started them is because I knew more about sound doctrine than my wife did, and I felt responsible for her spiritual growth, and so I started teaching her at home. And this is before I started videotaping. This was a couple months before that. So being married to a woman who wanted to spiritually grow, motivated me to grow as well. And you don't grow any more than when you teach, because you not only have to learn the subject, you have to learn it enough to explain it to somebody else. And women ask a lot of questions, so you got to know it really well. So, and the great thing about a woman is that she just, once she gets it, she just believes it, and she goes with it. And for me, I'm stubborn. I think men are more stubborn, bullheaded than women are, and it's harder for us to, I get the doctrine, I know what it says, but actually put it into practice, it's a lot harder for men than it is women. That's why when you look in the instructions that Paul gives Timothy, it says that for men, young men, they are to be sober-minded. And that's all it says. But for young women, they are to be chaste, keepers of the home, obedient to their husbands. There's a list of like 7 things there. It shows that women put the doctrine in practice, whereas the men are so stubborn-headed. They do good to just think correctly. Women, they get it right away, but they ask a lot of questions. So you have to learn it very well, and I think God does that it's a good compliment, because you learn it very well to teach it to your wife more than if you were going to do it yourself, which means the doctrine gets in you more, which means you're more likely to apply it. And then, of course, when you teach it correctly to your wife, then she's going to apply it as well. Another thing to consider, and Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, that if you do get married, such shall have trouble in the flesh. And that is just a result of the fact that men and women think differently. You may do something with the best intentions possible, and you do this, whatever it is, you say, it's probably something you said. You say something that you think is great, and you think, oh, my wife's going to love me, it's genuine what I just said, and I really love her, and I said it for her, and she's just going to think it's great. And you're excited to see her happy reaction to what you just said, and then she takes it the wrong way and gets mad at you. That's going to happen in marriage, because men and women think differently. You meant it for good, and you had good intentions, but she thinks of it completely different. Men are more surface level thinkers. What you say is what you mean, and that's the end of it. Women look for motivations behind what you say, and if they think, even though what you said is good, but they think your intention is bad, or there's some ulterior motive, or you don't mean what you say, then they're really going to be upset, because then they think you're trying to deceive them. And then they get all upset, even though you're not trying to. You meant what you said, but it just came out in a way, because a woman thinks differently, that she thinks you meant something different, even though that's not what you said. So you're going to have trouble in the flesh, Paul says, communication problems, working things out, talking about things that you don't want to talk about, and saying things that are misconstrued, and she gets upset, and it goes both ways too. Her idea, she's thinking more relationally, you're thinking more problem solving, and so you'll approach some problem and you'll say, oh, this is a solution right here, and it's clear to you that's what you should do, but to her, your solution may hurt somebody's feelings. And so then she says, well, that's not the solution, because to solve the problem for her, it's for everybody to feel good. It's not to actually take care of the issue. The issue for her is everybody getting along and the feelings. So then you go back and forth. You got the perfect solution. It would have been done by now if you were single, but you may have hurt somebody's feelings, but you don't really care. So you just go ahead and do it, and if they get hurt, fine. That's their problem. But your wife's not going to think like that. So I'm just bringing up things like that, not saying that the woman's wrong or the man's wrong. It's just men and women think differently. That's how God made us. And really a good reason to get married, and Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, if you can stay single and not burn with sexual desire and have to deal with sexual sin, then do so, because remain single. Remain single if sexual sin will not be a problem. But if sexual sin will be a problem, then you need to get married in spite of the trouble in the flesh, because he says it is better to marry than to burn, meaning it's better to get married than to burn with sexual lust and dealing with sexual sin. Sexual sin is a heart issue. Well, all sin is a heart issue. Jesus says that in Mark 7. And so it's not the actual physical act of sex. It's Jesus says in Matthew 5, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart after her, you have already committed adultery with her in your heart. So you have sexually sinned just by looking at a woman and thinking, yeah, I'd like to be with her, sexually speaking. Then you have already done so in your mind and you've sinned. So if that's going to be a problem for you, Paul says, it's better to go ahead and get married. And in the society that we're in today, that's going to be a problem for pretty much everybody. There may be some people that don't deal with that, few and far between, just because this society is so sexually charged. There's really no way of getting around it. You could say, okay, well, all the movies, half-naked women all around. Same thing with TV shows. And you may say, like me and my wife do, we say, okay, well, we're just going to watch the older shows, older TV shows that weren't like that. Okay, so you watch MeTV or Get TV, or one of those channels that shows just older shows. Cozy, I think, is another one. Well, then they show commercials with half-naked women. Can't get around it. So you say, okay, well, I'm just not going to watch TV. Very hard to do, especially if you're married, because that's a very difficult commitment for one person to make, but for two people to get to your spouse to think that same way too, probably not going to happen. But even if you do pull the plug on the TV, you still got to go out and work, get gas in the car, get food, get mouthwash, toothpaste. You got to go to the store. You got to live in the world. You can't just hole up in your house 24/7. You got to get out there, and when you get out there, there's half-naked women walking around because now that's acceptable in society. I remember watching videos, a documentary on Prohibition about 100 years ago, and you see pictures of women there, and these women didn't wear makeup, didn't wear jewelry, were modestly dressed. And now I look at today, and even women who are married with kids, who aren't trying to find a husband, Hollywood has told them that they need to feel sexy, they need to feel like they're attractive to men, and they wear makeup and jewelry and show off part of their bodies, even in that condition, when they're not looking for somebody. And pretty much all women wear makeup and jewelry nowadays. It's very rare to see someone who doesn't. Even if you're not trying to look for a man. My wife, she doesn't wear makeup and jewelry, and she dresses modestly, one of the very few women who do that. And I believe it's been very difficult for her to get a job because of that. She goes on interviews and she just, they think she's plain and ordinary because she doesn't dress like the world dresses, and they don't want to hire her. At least that's what I think, one of the reasons. So, here's somebody who is trying to be modest and not trying to look sexy and appeal to men, and it still hurts her, So I understand why women do this, but the bottom line is, for men, that means it's a sexually charged society. So, in pretty much 100% of the cases, for young men anyway, with a sexual drive, when you get older, it's not as bad, but when you're younger, especially in your teens and 20s, and probably 30s as well, it's very difficult to stay away from sexual sin if you're single. Well, if you're married too, for that matter, because all women try to look sexy, and you go to the store in Walmart, and then you see half-naked women on the magazines at the checkout aisle. What are you going to do? Yes, you're just surrounded by it, is my point. And since you're surrounded by it, you probably need to get married so that you don't commit the sexual sin. Now, or it's less likely that you do. And another part of getting married is that the woman can be a check and balance for you as well. Because when you're by yourself, sin is of the heart, and you can, have all these thoughts, but you can act out on your thoughts more so when you're single, as opposed to being married. If you want to get drunk at night, when you're single, you just get drunk, no problem. But if your wife's around, she's probably not going to like that. She's probably not wanting you to get drunk. So then, especially if you married a godly woman, so then you can't do that. And so it keeps, now you still have the desire in your heart, so you did sin, but the action of sin is worse than just having it in your heart, because of the consequence that results from the action of sin. One of the reasons God made men and women's minds differently is so that they would get married and be checks and balances for each other. It's the same thing for the woman. There are sins that she would commit if she wasn't married, but then with the man around, that she would avoid those things. So that's another good reason to get married, is the checks and balances. Now, as far as finding a godly woman, how do you do that? Well, the Bible, 1 Corinthians 7, the only criteria for getting married is that she be in the Lord. In other words, she has to be a Christian. You should not marry a non-Christian. Now, if you are married to a non-Christian, you should stay married. 1 Corinthians 7 tells you that, but it's going to be more difficult. How do you edify the other person when the person isn't saved? It's a lot harder. And you don't have the checks and balances, because you're using the mind of Christ and she's using her fleshly mind. So the checks and balances aren't there. She'll think of things differently. You decide that you're going to just study the Bible and stay at home because there's no Right Division church around, and she wants to go to a regular church, and so now to her you're an ungodly person, and but really you're the one making the godly decision. But because she's not saved and she's just following tradition, well then she doesn't understand that, and you can't convince her otherwise until she's saved, because she doesn't have the mind of Christ. So a lot of issues come up if you have an unbelieving spouse. So the first thing is you've got to have somebody who believes. Even if they don't believe right division, it's still going to be easier. You want somebody who believes right division, because then she accepts the Bible as her final authority, and then you can teach her the things that you learn, because the Bible is the authority. And if you learn something that goes against what the church teaches or what church history says, she'll believe the Bible over those things. Whereas if she's just a person who is saved and goes to a particular denomination and follows what that church says, well, then you're going to have issues with her learning, because she won't believe what you learn. So it is better to find somebody who is who takes the Bible as their final authority, is the number one part. So how do you do that? How do you find a godly woman? Very difficult. The Proverbs says a virtuous woman is very hard to find. And I will say that since God says it's better to, you should not marry someone unless they're a Christian, I would also say my suggestion is you probably can't find a godly woman who believes right division. The bad part about right division, it's a very lonely road. You're going against established mainstream Christianity. And as I mentioned before, women have a harder time going against the grain than men do. Men don't care. We don't care about hurting our family's feelings or losing our friends as much. I mean, we do care, but we don't care as much as women do. So chances are you're not, and that's why when you go to say a regular Baptist church, say a mega church, there are more women than there are men. But if you go to a Right Division church, there are more men than there are women, because the mega church is togetherness and family and unity in the faith, that type of thing. Whereas a Right Division Church is, of course, unity with God, but that's a going against man. And so it's there are very few people, and you have to go against your family, against your friends, against what establishment says, and that's a lot harder for women to do than men. So if you're lucky enough to have a Right Division Church in your area and you go to that, chances are you're not going to find a woman to marry there. So my suggestion, and this is what I did, is you try to find someone who will accept the Bible as their final authority. So you find somebody, and you don't know that at first. You say, hey, do you accept the Bible as your final authority? Well, all Christian women are going to say, yeah, I do. But in practice, most of them don't. So you're just going to have to test it out. My wife and I met on eHarmony. I lived in California. She lived in Alabama. And basically over the phone, I'd go over things with her and show her things that were against what her church taught. And, sometimes she objected to it, but then, after a while she understood it and said, well, that's what the Bible says, and I believe that. And when you can get her to go against what her church teaches, then you found someone who accepts the Bible as their final authority, unless you're just, incredibly good looking and she's desperate to get married, and so she's just doing it to be with you, to agree with you. I didn't have to worry about that because I'm not a handsome guy, so no problem there for me. But if you are a handsome guy, well, then that's harder. It's harder to deal with that because you don't know what she's going through. But over time, you just have to sort of figure it out. So anyway, I went on eHarmony. I looked for a Christian woman who didn't smoke, didn't drink, and didn't want kids, because that was my criteria. Those are personal preferences. God doesn't say, usually when you look at profiles on there, you'll see, well, I want somebody that's this tall and this weight and all this. God doesn't care about that. But if you do, then you need to, make sure. If you have a woman who is overly concerned with your outward appearance, then that's probably someone you want to stay away from, because she's not adorning the doctrine, but she's adorning the flesh more. That's why when I went on eHarmony, I would not put a picture of myself out there. And some women would just automatically reject me because they couldn't see what I looked like. And that was fine, because that was easy to, get rid of them, because they're going to be concerned with the outward rather than the inward. And so I don't want to be with someone like that. Okay, we'll continue this next time.